And then, of course, like Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan. So Don Juan has had a huge influence on me. And I found it very unrealistic and unavailable. I found it remarkably profound and simple. And it's like I know that this is applicable to my everyday life, but these books and stories aren't necessarily. So does that make sense? What I'm trying to say? It felt like really good science fiction. Like the science is freaking solid, but the rest of it just feels like untangible fiction, right? I'm coming from a state of severe psychological distress, psychological suffering. And this idea of turning into birds and traveling across to this fifth dimensional portal of dreaming bodies, I'm like, oh, this is for the fucking birds, excuse my language, but that's how I felt. Does that make sense? So really important nuggets of basic principle and wisdom, but nothing really that I felt like I could super apply.
I felt like that too, Ernest.
Okay.
A bit off, off the wall stuff like being in slings and all that stuff in some of the books that was really quite weird. You would nearly think you were on drugs just reading it, but other stuff, nuggets, diamonds that you could really
Mm-hmm.
apply, but so simplistic. And like you said at one point, what he was doing all along, what Don Juan was doing all along was taking Carlos out for a walk and distracting him from to try and create space in his head. That's all he was doing all along.
Mm-hmm. And he called
But
it.
this
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, but the simplicity of all that, I think sometimes I state the obvious so much, but the simplicity of it all really, really appealed to me, like sitting on a crate
Mm-hmm.
out in the front of his porch in the Mexican sun,
Mm-hmm.
watching the shadows on the mountains. All that
Mm-hmm.
really, really rocked my soul. I
And
loved
that
all that.
and that's how you know it has a nugget of truth,
Yeah,
right? Because it doesn't read like fiction. It reads like this is getting to my core, but it's also kind of kooky at the same time, right? But context disarrangement is one of basically the underlying tricks that Don Juan was pulling on Carlos to help stop internal dialogue. And they use and I'm using their words, so we can't say Ernest, you know, he said stop internal dialogue because it was the prerequisite for anything else. Context disarrangement is taking you into a place that you've never been before, like vacation, and then all of a sudden your senses are being flooded with
Oh,
everything around you because you're not used to that contextual setting.
I get it. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I just never heard it in a term, and it's
Oh
my new
God, yes.
favorite thing.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. All rights
It's like
reserved on it,
it's
but yeah,
like an oxymoron. It's like
yeah.
cognitive dissonance.
Uh,
I'm going to be using that in too many sentences.
but it clears your mind. The reason it clears your mind is because your senses are being flooded, which is exactly what we're doing with the four directions of attention.
Right,
We're
right.
yeah, we're flooding our sensory perception so that the momentum of thought can't continue unobstructed. Like it will, the famous, unless it's acted on by an outside force, it will maintain its inertia and its momentum, right? It can gain momentum if it's given energy. And of course, what do? I take that and I make it about the mind. And you can see that exact principle in the mind. If you give it energy, it gains inertia. It will not stop. I mean, it might be interrupted by the other things going on in your life, but it will pick up where it left off because it's not being acted on by an outside force or acted on by a force. And guess what that force is? Your will, your attention, your intention.
It's the whole reason why people get the vacation feeling.
Exactly.
You could live on a beach, and I do. I walk the boardwalk because there's context disarrangement. Because when I'm in my house and I'm thinking about the the data of things that I have to do and accomplish and things like that, and I want to get away from it. I mean, I can do it by deliberate modulation, but it's easier just to go walk on the beach.
Yeah.
So when you're away and you don't have all the stimuli of what kicks in with habit and momentum, you have context disarrangement. And that's why vacation feels so wonderful. And you go, oh, if I could just live in Jamaica, I wouldn't have any problems. But pretty soon your habit and momentum would kick in and Jamaica would become a place of tension if if you had the same stimuli, unless you're deliberately making your point of attention elsewhere.
That sums it up. Yeah. Hey, Jerry, are you there?
Well,
We have Jerry has a famous uh, saying written down, and it is context disarrangement. Where the mind is the least, put it there the most. I have a technique of looking at what would be normally considered by others as mundane. That's where my attention is the most. You want to know what I'm doing with my external sense of attention? I'm looking at freaking rocks. Like I'm making sure that my mind is where most minds commonly are not. That's old, right? That's old school.
intentional context disarrangement.
Intentional context disarrangement is what we're doing. Absolutely. Yeah. And we're doing it the same way that Don Juan recommended, by flooding our sensory perception with deliberate intentional points that we haven't, well, the intended in advance stuff, that was pretty much the way that I organized it. He's never said that. But long story short, I didn't have enough techniques from those books, so I started to apply Tai Chi. Tai Chi gave me techniques. Tai Chi tells me to listen behind me. Tai Chi tells me to always keep my knees bent. Tai Chi tells me to walk from heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe. Tai Chi tells me to be very aware of my body and my surroundings. Tai Chi tells me to use inclusive vision so I can increase proprioception, because it's a martial art and I need to be spatially aware in any type of combat scenario.
So you had a toolbox of points of attention that you had practiced that had some actual feeling attached to it. They were easily accessible, so you used them in your 4 directions practice to embody, to hold, to elongate, and to maintain.
Absolutely.
Not just in the Tai Chi room.
Yes. And then, of course, from Tai Chi, I started to realize how it works. And then I was able to start to apply different techniques and do different things because I had a clear understanding of what I was doing. And guess what? It always goes back to that. So when I'm sitting here worrying about my comprehensive exams, or I don't worry about that, but I feel the pull, right? I feel that old habit of, oh, I better spend my moment concerned about a month and a half away from now, thinking about like putting myself in an imaginary scenario of failure. That's a good idea, right? It's like, where the hell does that come from? The term, Jerry, context disarrangement is a term that's used in psychology, but it's also used directly by Don Juan in the book, The Second Ring of Power. No. Tales of Power, excuse me. Second Ring of Power is really kooky. Like there's no techniques in that thing.
I hadn't heard that until just now. Would you mind just defining that in the room so I can copy it?
Yeah, context disarrangement is basically when you are disarranging your normal sensory experience. So what you normally experience is not occurring. So if you normally wake up in your bedroom, waking up in a hotel room would be context disarrangement because you're not used to that hotel room. You're not used to those surroundings. You're not used to that alarm clock. You're not used to that coffee maker. You're not used to that. You're not used to that. You're not used, and that creates the context disarrangement. And that's why vacation is so nice. And that's why seeing new things are so nice. And that's why new people in the beginning are so nice, because it's all helping to create what the mind just loves, which is context disarrangement so that it can organize it and put it in a box. Because the mind is fundamentally a tool or a reflection of entropy. But that's a conversation for another setting. Did that help, Jerry? Or did I?
No, yeah, until you said the mind likes it. we like to have context.
The mind likes context disarrangement. People jump out of airplanes for context disarrangement because the context disarrangement is what creates that surge of emotion and energy and vibration, because it's thrilling. You've never done that before. Like we're not attuned to jumping out of an airplane at 10,000 feet, right? It makes space for the mind, right? Because in the context disarrangement, the exterior starts to become a key feature of your landscape, of your TV screen that we talked about in class, right? Your perception. Mm-hmm.
This would be the opposite of where human beings also, almost get addicted to chaos. That's where you sometimes find people, the abuse of growing up, you go out and repeat it. It's just what you're used to. So this is the opposite. I think I'm getting it all.
I don't know if I've ever thought of the opposite of context disarrangement would be you're waking up.
You're talking about, that's why people love that excitement that you see all the time and what we do to ourselves.
Right. So the opposite of context disarrangement would be you wake up in the same room and it's not different. Well, it's not different. I have to put that in air quotes.
The opposite is habit and momentum.
Habit and momentum.
Yeah.
I've never thought about that.
Well, here's a quick example. The business CEOs, men, typically in the past, were getting heart attacks a lot from stress. And so they, as a counter measure, they were teaching them to juggle. They gave them juggling balls and told them for an hour or half an hour, stop and try to learn to juggle. And you would think that juggling is a difficult thing and why introduce more stress? But what it did was context disarrangement. It interrupted the habit and momentum of the mind. The only thing you could focus on was the juggling. It was very hard to be thinking about other things when you're learning to juggle, because you have to devote your attention to it. So that was a context disarrangement. You're still in your office, your phone is still ringing, your secretary's still outside, your business meeting is coming up, but you're juggling for a half an hour, and it switches it disarranges the habitual repetitive pattern of your mind.
Right. Exactly. It's an interruption. It's like throwing a wrench in a system that is very used to repeating itself. And so Santina asked a really good question. And this is also going to get to the point that this class can seem very cutting, right? But I'm not going to ever try to be rude. And I want to be careful to moderate my own opinions about these things. It's important for me to express principle and why the principle can help somebody and how it applies to the overall goal, which I still haven't explained yet, which I think is important. Why the hell is warrior training? What is that? Like, why are we doing it? So hopefully I'll be able to explain that before we go. But this is really good discussion, and so I'm going to get to the nitty gritty. It's not bad or good, but we live in a society that is severely addicted to essentially what is an unconscious manifestation of context disarrangement. So it's why the mind is always seeking these things. It's why a person would be spending 5 days of the week just looking for the 2 days of the weekend. It's why a person would be working their ass off for months and months and months and months just to take a week vacation. It's why they would sit through traffic to go to a job that they don't really like, to make money that they don't really think is what they deserve in a setting where they're not really respected, and a countdown to retirement. Now, that's not to be doom and gloom, but some people are generating that type in generally, and this isn't declaring war, and I'm not, this isn't, but this will start to get to the root of things, is so it's not bad or good, but the extreme is to be attached and addicted to that. But what would be the opposite of context disarrangement is actually just being comfortable in settings that are familiar, because the mind can find newness. It's always moving. The subtle is always moving, and you can always feel it, right? Contentment is that subtle, and that's ultimately, thank you, Santina, that's what we're getting at. We're coming together for warrior training so that we can learn to perceive and interact with the subtle. And I can't tell you what that will look like or how to do it, I can only introduce, because you already know, I can only introduce a system that will introduce a way to interject context disarrangement at will and bring your attention above the threshold of active recognition to interrupt what is interfering with your ability to perceive and accurately disseminate and decode basically that information which is subtle. Does that make sense? Subtle information is spirit. That's what we're talking about. But we're not really talking about it because we can't. But
it still
yes.
is the principles. It's still observing the principles.
That's how we set it
That's
up.
how I knew, yes, that's how I knew I was starting to observe the subtle, was because of the practice that we put in and the practice of my deliberate attention. Then the subtle became perceivable to me. I could break it down to the same principles as the less subtle was what we were doing in the beginning, the clunky, here I am, where is my mind? Did I put it there? What is a trick of attention? All the basic stuff, all the same principles as noticing the subtle. It's just the momentum and that I've gained in the practice enables me to do that. Talking about the subtle right away would have confused me.
Absolutely. And it probably would have been, for most people, will be interpreted in the ways that they understand the subtle, which may not be what I'm talking about.
Right. Individual perception comes into play a lot more in the subtle.
And who else calls it the subtle?
Right. Hard to describe. Right.
Yeah. Nobody told me to call it the subtle. I'm calling it that because that's how it feels. You know, that's of course it's not always so subtle, you know, when the mind is clear enough. Okay, does all of that make sense so far? So
give me a brief example of the subtle.
Intuition.
One more.
It's such a powerful one, but any type of like knowing without having a good reason.
That's what you're calling subtle. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Also,
yeah, I didn't know that terminology.
State of being itself. Emotion can be subtle. It shouldn't be. Like we should have enough self-awareness that our emotion is not super subtle. Like we're aware of it, but it's not shouting at us because it doesn't have to shout. We're already privy to it.
So in the course of you experiencing your intuition, it felt subtle to you. It felt inner. I'm not trying to be difficult. I
would say that it's less,
understand intuition. I have it every day.
I would say that it's
don't
also,
know.
I just want to answer your question. It's also because it's less tangible in terms of the island of the practical. And so it's a functional word to describe, show me your intuition, show me spirit, show me the vibration. You know, it's more difficult. We have to break out different instrumentations that are actually not really representing it directly. It's representing it just a way that we can materialize it in our own mind, understand it in our own way of understanding, because the brain does have a limited capacity when it comes to the full scope of what's potentially available to experience. That's a lot of words. Playing back, I promise they all make sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I needed to ask that because I would have used subtle in a whole different way for different feelings. So I'm glad I asked.
Well, the computer
depends on the receiver of the subtle, the interpreter of the subtle. Like that's why I wrote tension in the room. Some people may walk into a room and have not noticed the feeling in the room whatsoever. Others people can walk in the room and say and feel that there was an uncomfortable discussion that just happened in that room, or a tense. So that's subtle, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and you see how everything has a relativity to it. So to one person, that's not so subtle. To another person, that's impossible almost for them at that moment to perceive because there's too much interference. And it really helps you understand the interference principle as well. But also subtle is literal. You know, show me the molecular makeup of my attention. Where is it? Show me my thought. Okay, sure, you can put me behind certain instrumentation and we can look at the computer screen again. I'm not really looking at your thought. I'm looking at a computer screen, making an image that represents your thought. It's not thought. I'm not seeing your thought. I'm seeing color patterns that are meant to represent where thought is occurring, where energy is more represented, where certain neurotransmitters are occurring more in the brain. It's chemical, so we're able to perceive the chemicals, and well, it can also be different forms of like magnetism and electrical as well. But you get the point. So that's another reason that I use the word subtle, is because it's like, show me your attention. It's like, well, like, you see it? I'm looking at you. That's my attention. So it's more subtle. I can't touch it. Can't grab my attention, even though that's a phrase that we say. Did that grab your attention? Okay, so what is warrior training? What is it? It's still a part of the 4 directions, but it's picking up at what I believe will be the most challenging aspect of embodying the 4 directions. And I use the word embodying. Maintaining, learning to elongate the 4th direction. So we have 3 famous words, or 3 words that I hope become famous with us, is establish, elongate, and maintain. That's the order of operations. In the very beginning, we start to just establish one direction of attention, maybe 5 times in a day. And then, of course, it starts to pick up momentum, and then we flash forwards. For 7 years doing this. Warrior training should pick up, and it's okay if you're not doing this. This information will still be useful to you. And then when you have a better understanding of how to execute your own practice, how to perform your own practice, then this information will just click. So it's not, if you're not doing what I'm about to say, that's okay. You'll still understand it, and it will still be beneficial in some way. If I would have heard this 20 years ago, I would still have been able to make use out of it, even though I wasn't doing what it's saying. So we have 4 directions of attention. We're looking to establish, elongate, and maintain. This is assuming that we have already begun to maintain internal and external directions of attention, and that we're now really starting to focus on breath. Does that make sense? We're able to establish all 4 at that point. You can establish all 4 in the very beginning. Actually, I could take a person in a 90-minute session, and I will show them all 4 directions of attention directly. They won't be able to deny it. They won't be able to say they don't understand it, because I can do it with you. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Look at this mouse. Continue to pay attention to this mouse. Concentrate on this mouse. And then I'm going to talk about something completely different and ask them if they ever stopped paying attention to the mouse. They're going to say, of course I did. Why? I never told you to stop paying attention to it. Never once did I say stop paying attention to the mouse. I'm just using mouse as an arbitrary object that I would use in the room as a form of context disarrangement. Because they're not used to looking at a mouse. Why would they do that? Or an object, a mundane object. So warrior training picks up right about the time that a person is doing really well at establishing, elongating, and maintaining. Doesn't mean all the time, but it means a good portion, an internal and external point of attention that they have intended in advance, that is from their toolbox. They're redirecting back to it, because that's how we do this practice, redirection. Does that make sense? And let's just take a poll. Yes. Let's just make sure this is appropriate. Who here is able to establish attention on their breath?
I was just going to say that the example that you just gave right then, as I was laying here doing it, it was profound.
Okay.
I wouldn't have defined it like that. When you were just saying I could be in a room and I could show you how to do it, I was already doing it when you said it. And then when the 2 came together, it was like, I got to be quiet. But anyway, do more of that, please. Well, that was awesome.
Imagine having that after a session of acupuncture that was meant to calm your emotions and bring chi down and harmonize. Oh yeah. That's the ticket. Okay, but that's a whole other thing. Okay, so who was able to establish attention on their breath? Everybody. Who's able to elongate it? And I'm talking about attention on your breath. Just as if I was pointing out the mouse and the computer mouse. What are some ways that you elongate it?
Notice the aspects of it. It's a warmer, cooler coming in, warmer coming out. Noticing the transition between the inhale and the exhale, just focusing my points of attention on the breath itself. Chest expanding or abdomen expanding and contracting, that kind of thing. Rise and fall, whatever.
Excellent. Okay. Now, outside of a formal practice, who is able to maintain attention on their breath for more than 15 or 30 minutes? This is quantifying just for the sake of giving an example of what I'm talking about.
Consecutively difficult for me. I don't know if I've gone longer than 30 minutes, but more than 50% of the day, I could say yes, but not consecutively.
Consecutively. This is maintaining. Maintaining implies a type of consecutive nature. If you start to go away from it and come back, you can determine whether it was broken or not. But about half an hour.
Maybe on an hour walk I could,
Mhm.
but not necessarily when I'm engaged in life.
And that's where this practice picks up, and those are the 5 techniques that I want to talk about. Because just like Donna mentioned, there's a lot of things that we can talk about with breath. Probably thousands. But some of that stuff isn't really all that great when it comes to when I'm standing at the stoplight, when I'm in traffic. Haven't really timed it, but I know I have attention on it throughout the day. Now, you don't really have to time it. I was just using that as like an example to because we had to use a quantifiable segment to get the point across. Yeah, I don't really time it either, but I just know that I'm aware of it throughout the day. And I also know when I'm going away from it. Usually when things are starting to pick up, the phone is ringing, I got a person in front of me, Bob's over here at the clinic trying to talk to me, and I'm like, and okay, yeah, I started to lose my breath attention. It happens. But either I don't lose it completely because I feel myself going away from it, or I lose it for just a second and immediately go back to it, but that's still all maintaining as far as I'm concerned. It hasn't faded to the back. So that's where we pick up, because I think that is actually one of the most challenging things in this practice is maintaining breath awareness. But I also think that by maintaining breath awareness, you can set up the 4th direction to a more subtle degree. Right, Jerry? We're talking about subtle. And by subtle, I mean state of being. That's more subtle for people. It's very difficult for a lot of people to feel their state of being because it includes so much, emotion. I could probably ask somebody what's the emotion you're feeling right now? And they might be, hold on, let me think about it. I'm good. I was like, oh, good is an emotion. Okay. That's why they're kind of, at first, they're like, that's weird. Because when somebody asks me how I'm doing, I always respond with how I'm feeling. So they're like, how are you today? As they're coming into the clinic. And I'm like, I feel great. And when they first meet me, they're like, I like that. And I'm like, what? And they're like, you answer with how you feel. And I'm like, well, what would my answer be? I don't understand. Is it how I feel the most? And like, that's my experience. How I feel is of the absolute utmost importance. I don't understand because the bus showed up right on time, I'm good, or because I got an extra $1 off on my latte this morning, everything is good. Like, I get it, but what if I didn't get the $1 off? What if the bus splashed me with water? Now I'm bad. I don't want to be a leaf at the mercy of my circumstances of the day. Fuck that. I'd rather be a more deliberate individual who can dictate how I feel to a degree. There's going to be challenges and things, but overall, I'm not a leaf at the mercy of my day. Forget that. Okay, so does that make sense where we're picking up? This is still the 4 directions of attention. It's still the same practice, but I can tell you from experience that maintaining attention on your breath is not common for a reason. How many people do you think you know personally that can maintain attention on their breath for the majority of their day? And also with very little interruption.
A few, because I don't think anybody has even offered to for them to try it. Like, it's not even something people have tried on. Why would I pay attention to my breath all day? I'm doing other stuff.
Well, so am I. I'm doing other stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that's the response.
Oh, I do all the best stuff with breath.
Yes, I understand.
I memorize better with breath. I have better interactions with human beings with breath. I have better interactions with my day, with the moment, with light, with everything if I'm more.
Absolutely. But your question was, how many people do you know that do that? And I was like, I don't even know that people would even consider doing that. For what reason?
That's weird.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Donna. When he asked that, I'm thinking, yeah, it's not even in a discussion.
Really? I don't understand why not. It doesn't make any sense to me why not. Actually, it does.
People aren't talking about this. I mean, we see it because, we're drawing it to us. Like, I see
he's just being obtuse, Jerry. He understands exactly.
I understand. I'm being obtuse, yeah, intentionally, because it brings me to my point.
I'm still in bed. Sorry.
Only in yoga class. I like that answer, Santina, because that's accurate for the majority. That's not declaring war. That's just a statistical, factual statement. It's a statement of fact. Our opinion in response to that statement of fact could be another thing. Okay, so we know where we're at. I'll get to Santina's question, and then I'll give you a little bit of where we're going, and maybe how we're gonna get there. But yeah, Santina, question.
I noticed for myself that I can concentrate on my breath for about a half hour, and then I got to redirect. But I also noticed that if I concentrate on my breath at a different part of the body, it will last longer.
Okay.
I don't know if that.
I think that's
context disarrangement.
That's one way. That's one way of looking at it, but also I think what you're noticing is really important, and it's an empirical fact to you, right? So you're seeing something empirically in your own experience that I didn't tell you, that Donna didn't tell you, that you didn't read or anything. You just noticed that when you pay attention to certain parts of your body, when you breathe, it's easier.
Yeah. So that's just my chemical soup?
No, what you're saying is a principle, and it's embedded into the practice, because you just gave the example of an internal point of attention.
Mm-hmm. And so let's say like if I concentrate and start in the beginning of the day on the Dantian, it doesn't last as long as when I redirect and I say, all right, concentrate breathing from your heart. It changes it for me. It'll last longer. I don't know why, but it does.
Who cares why? Because if it feels like an area that is more accessible, that helps you with the goal of maintaining or elongating awareness on your breath, bingo. I mean, I think that's fine. And the Dantian doesn't have to be where you begin at all. I began there because that was really all I understood with Tai Chi. But now that I have more of a medical understanding and a much deeper understanding of what they meant by Dantians in the first place, the mind and all emotion is associated with the heart in Chinese medicine. So I think that paying attention to the chest and heart area makes a lot of sense. Maybe for someone else, though. No.
That everyone's practice is different.
Everyone's practice may be a little bit different, right?
We talked about that in the beginning a lot. What's your lowest hanging fruit? If breath isn't it,
No.
then pick something that you can maintain focus on. If you maintain focus in a certain way and that becomes so familiar that it doesn't hold your attention, it's harder to hold your attention there, then think about it in another way. So what Santina is describing is, you just said a moment ago, we could talk about breath and how we elongate and maintain our breath in a million different ways. And that was exactly an example of that.
Right.
She
Yeah.
was picking the lowest hanging fruit or changing up the way that she focuses on her breath so that she can maintain it. And that's going to be individual for each person. And that's what we spent 5 years just giving each other examples of how each of us do it differently.
Yes, differently. Well, also warrior training is going to give you some things to do specifically. And based on what Santina just said, she has a head start. So if she's paying attention to points in her body while she breathes, she's actually ahead of what I'm going to be recommending in warrior training over the next few weeks. Because warrior training is more of a prescribed. I want you to do this. Yeah, and there's still a little bit of wiggle room, of course, because I'm not Don Juan. And it doesn't need to be that way. But in general, so another point that Santina made, I think inadvertently, is that we should have, if we're talking about maintaining the breath, we should still have our internal and external point of attention active first. I'm not talking about maintaining the breath awareness without internal and external awareness, because you're not aware of yourself. You don't have the self-awareness necessary to maintain the breath, and especially to be gentle with your breath, which is the technique style that I talk about. All of my breathing.
Yes. You can discern it. If you can't discern, that's considered a subtlety in 2 degrees. If I can't discern the difference between input and output, then I'll have a more difficult time with it, right?
Yes, you will. Yes. Mm-hmm. Also, you won't be as aware of your emotional state. You won't be as aware of where you are now, because remember, okay. And this is you're really going to understand this because it's so consistent.
Above the threshold or below the threshold. Yep.
Above the threshold or below is like one of those fundamental, and we're kind of jiving, like it's a thing where it's fluctuating, but hopefully we don't dip below very often. And then in this practice, we may never have to dip below unless we go under anesthesia or for operation. But where was I going? Okay.
Discerning.
Well, if we're going to, so we were talking about the 3 words that are really important moving forward is establish, elongate, and maintain. We won't have the power necessary to maintain attention on the breath in a gentle way if we don't first maintain awareness on ourselves. So remember, establish, elongate, and maintain. When we establish it's more elongate or maintain one direction of attention, we will improve our ability to focus on everyday life. Because remember that this could be a 9-year practice for a person who's just starting this. Maybe they're getting it from me in a clinical setting and it's a part of a healing journey, right? That could be years. Who knows? So we have to look at it that way. We've been here for 7 years or 6 years or whatever, but it's really important to remember that this took decades for me to put together, and to really drive it with momentum. That takes energy. Well, no, it doesn't take energy. It takes reducing the interference necessary for the energy to flow smoothly so that the power is there, and that's done through practice, right? Okay, so establish, elongate, and maintain one direction of attention will improve your ability to focus and concentrate. I'm just stopping there. Do you think that the world, planet Earth, the Western culture, could benefit from a practice that will help them focus and concentrate? LOL, yes. So this doesn't even have to be done to the degree that we're talking about it today to benefit people. A person could say, Ernest, I don't really want to do all that other stuff. It sounds hard. But I do think that I can establish, elongate, and maintain some attention on my environment, and I'll practice that throughout the day, and I'll get better at focusing and get better at concentrating on everyday tasks that I need to get done. And it's like, well, congratulations, that's awesome. I have no issue to take with that whatsoever. And a person could just stop the practice, stop advancing the practice there. Is that okay with everybody? Does that make sense? It's important. This is important to talk about and to really grasp that that's what this is. This practice is what I'm explaining to you now. Okay. If we're able to establish, elongate, and we're starting to really maintain two directions of attention, that will create an opportunity to be aware of yourself. We have put together an organized practice that will help a person be more self-aware. And I don't mean that in any abstract, ideological, or philosophical sense. I mean, a person will be more aware of their body, their emotions, their physical space, where they are in physical space and time, the words that are going through their mind, the shit that's coming out of their mouths. They will be aware of it as it's occurring. Does anybody here think that the world in general, Western society, that people could use more awareness of themselves as they're occurring in space and time? God, yes. And if a person just wanted to do the practice for that reason, because they want more self-awareness and they don't really want all this other junk, I don't know about the third and the fourth direction. That sounds too hard. That's weird. But I do like the idea of being aware of myself, for whatever reason. Maybe they have a reason. Maybe they just understand the value of self-awareness. I mean, it's one of the most amazing aspects of being a human being is that we can actually be aware of ourselves and how we're relating to our environment. Like, what? I can be aware of my own awareness, which is metacognition, the kids call it these days. That's cool. That's really interesting that the mind can even do that. Well, why don't I ever do it then? Why are people going around their entire lives not utilizing these amazing aspects of our brain's functional capacity? It's functional to be able to do that with your mind, to be very self-aware, because that's where emotional intelligence comes from. That's where learning comes from. That's where growing comes from. That's how a person becomes a better version of themselves. I don't usually talk that way because I don't like it, but you get what I mean. And then that brings us to warrior training. Because at warrior training, we've already started to get really good at maintaining at least these two directions of attention. And we're probably flirting with all four throughout the day in some way. To be honest, it's not that linear that we do this practice in that, straight fashion. It's just presented that way because I think that it will be very common for people. And maintaining awareness on your breath throughout the day, I guess if people aren't even talking about it, like that's going to be difficult. Like that's going to be a challenge at least. And one of the reasons, okay, so does all that make sense? And then we'll get into the reasons and we'll start talking about the breath and how to maintain the breath awareness. But does that make sense where we are now? And if you're not maintaining both directions of attention, that's okay. You still understand what I'm talking about. And just keep doing your practice. Thinking about your practice isn't doing your practice. Just doing your practice is doing your practice. Unless the thinking is directing you back to your practice, and then it has become a functional asset. But does this make sense so far? Where are we now? Warrior training.
It makes so much sense. And I loved the realization of everything since the beginning of the practice. But warrior training feels great. I love warrior training. Just love it. Everything you're saying is making me go, yay, we're doing warrior training again. It makes sense to me.
I'm going to have to make it harder because you're too happy about it. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so one of the aspects of warrior training is I am going to present you with a quote from Don Juan, and it is going to not bode well for society. And it's going to sound a little judgy. It is not. This is not an opinion that I'm placing on people to hold over them. But it is more of an explanation of relationships and statements of fact. How, if it triggers us or if we feel a certain kind of way about it, then with our self-awareness, we can, see, why is this occurring? What does this say about me? And I will do my best to avoid from interjecting opinions. We just want to look at observable things that are occurring and talk about that. And we're starting with the breath. So first I'll start with one of the most important aspects that makes the breath difficult. And then I'll tell you the quote, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up because I think we're already past an hour.
Tell me the quote, because I have to go and I don't want to go, but I have an appointment.
The first quote is the most popular Don Juan quote, and we'll flesh it out a little bit more, but it is, you either make yourself miserable, you either make yourself happy, and there's different versions of this. You make yourself strong. I think strong is the more direct quote, or you make yourself miserable. The amount of effort is the same. And when we first hear this, we're like, no, it's easier to make myself miserable. Allow me to explain. And then the breath and the breath techniques. So did you get the quote, Donna? You can Google it because it's out there.
I did. I love it.
Okay. Yeah. And they're not going to be also popular. These are my quotes from Don Juan. You see this big ass binder? Yeah. We got a long way to go. But the thing that makes the breath difficult is because they're trying to take techniques from formal practices. That's why it's like nostril breathing. You're not gonna go around throughout your day just just going back and forth with your nose like I'm embodying my breath technique. Nobody does that. You could. That would be context disarrangement for other people. You'd be creating that for others. And are people comfortable with that when you create context disarrangement for them without their permission? No, they don't like that. It makes them feel funny. People don't like that.
Sometimes people come to me because I established their context disarrangement for them. So they go, oh, I need a dose of Donna. And then they come dump on me all their tension. And I don't know, some words come out of me, energy comes out of me that helps them feel relaxed. And then they go back out the door and pick it all back up again.
Yeah. Well, here's an example. One of the things that's really popular when you do like a formal breath practice is to count your breath or to elongate it. Take a deep breath. Who is familiar with those terms when it comes to the breath? It's like, okay, that's why you can't do it all day because you're trying so hard to manipulate it. It requires way too much energy. The nervous system isn't built that way. Like it's both sensory and motor for, using the nerves because it can be both voluntary and involuntary. Count to 8 when inhaling, release for longer. This is all fine and formal practices, but if you try to do that throughout the day, I think that you're actually going to be making it much more difficult for yourself. If not, getting in your own way and you won't get there. Okay, and this is recorded, Donna, so if you need to catch the tail end, we're going to go ahead and put it on YouTube because we're not getting into the because there's some stuff that is just going to confront Western culture, and that's I don't like it sometimes, but it is what it is. And I'm going to do my best to avoid opinions and interjecting opinions because we don't, as a presenter, I don't want to present my opinions on subjects, but yeah. Okay, so moving forward over the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about 5 breath techniques that lend to the first breath technique, which is smoothness. Smoothness is that lightness that we want to add to the breath so that we're able to be aware of it without using all of the energy necessary to manipulate it. And it's okay to manipulate your breath sometimes. I'm not declaring war on that. Do it during your formal practice. Do it whenever you need it throughout the day as a form of self-regulation. But if we're talking about elongating and maintaining awareness on our breath, believe me, we got to go gentle. We have to be subtle with it. And I can help do that with a few different techniques. Make sense? Yes, and Tina, question. Oh, did you still have a question? Or is it just an old hand up?
Yeah, it was just an old hand up, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, well. Think of a question real quick. All right, so one of the things that we don't really account for is the long term, or the momentum of something, or how much it has had an opportunity to accumulate, especially if we haven't had a really broad or acute self-awareness, like awareness of ourselves. We're not seeing these things. And if a person isn't self-aware, typically they're learning through bad behavior that doesn't benefit them, or other people have to tell them about themselves because they're not seeing it. There's no awareness of themselves. And that's a condition for some folks. Not all, of course. Maybe not even most. I don't even know about that. I can't even say that with any, confidence. But many, many folks have almost no awareness of themselves in space and time as they occur. It is what it is. It's fine. Go to Trader Joe's and tell them. I mean, it is what it is. You're getting knocked over because people aren't noticing their environment. They're looking at their phones or they're talking on their devices, and it is what it is. It's fine. I don't care. I don't feel an emotional response from it, but I do feel the need to be even more aware so that I don't get bumped into, because I don't like that. I do like my space being my human space to exist. I'm a fan of that. Okay. So being aware of the breath is something that should be very subtle, but we have accumulated for the vast majority of our life a breath that is almost always below the threshold of active recognition. Well, we only do it when we think we need to, when we need to self-regulate, or when we need to get ready or pumped up for something or whatever, But as you guys have pointed out, this idea of being able to be aware of our breath for at least the majority of our waking experience is not even something that people are considering. I don't even understand why. That doesn't even make sense to me. I've considered it for decades. I'm like, well, why not? I don't understand. I get that my breath is wired to be both, but why can't I be aware of my breath for the majority of the day? It doesn't make sense. Nobody could tell me why I couldn't, other than distractions. You would get too distracted. You don't have the concentration or the focus necessary. And that actually was true at the time. So that was an incorrect statement. Those were true things. I didn't have the capacity or the skill necessary to do that at the time. But I practiced and I got better. So we have been spending decades accumulating certain responses to the world. Don Juan's was wrath. He had the tendency to get angry at everything and want to exact revenge on everybody. Carlos's, I think, was pettiness, or mine was self-importance, which is where anxiety comes from. So those were the ways that I tended to respond to challenges or when things didn't go my way. Carlos Castaneda would go into poor me. Like, oh, why is this happening to poor, Carlos? And this is my lot in life, and I'm such a victim, and oh. And then my thing to launch into when anything was going on was, oh my God, what will they think? Like, what is everybody going to think about me? Are they going to like me anymore? Am I still going to have friends? I didn't think those words because that's really basic, but that's basically what I was doing, right? Does that make sense? Now, that was really easy for me to do, and I'm not going to call you all out. Every one of you has one. You have a way that you have responded up to this point in a way that you maybe wasn't so graceful or wasn't beneficial. It didn't lead us in a direction. You've done that before, at least, even if you're not doing it right now, so you know what I'm talking about. Didn't it feel really easy to take something personal and get offended at a certain point in our lives? It did for me. Like, I'm speaking from myself, and if you If it resonates with you, then you can let me know. But yeah, especially when I was younger. It was really bad when I was younger. Yeah.
Yeah, wanting to be right was one of mine.
Wanting to be right. Yeah. That's a good one. I mean, it's it's an excellent example. So you don't have to give me yours, but if you need help finding it, then that's a one-on-one, and we can do that because it was there. We don't have to find it unless that's something you're super interested in, but it's just a principle that it's the accumulation principle of momentum. We can actually gain momentum at dysfunctional traits, habits that don't benefit us. Would anybody disagree with that? Of course not, right? Like we can generate things that don't really benefit us. They can gain momentum. The habits can gain momentum. We can get attached to them. And it could lead to like certain addictive behaviors or even physical psycho-emotional addictions. And all of it becomes easier because we get practiced at it. You get best at what you practice the most. Even if being an asshole is what you practice. Do you guys remember me talking about that back in 2017 or whatever? 2017, 2018. You get best at what you practice most, even if it's being an asshole. You just get really easy and good at being an asshole because that's what you've been practicing. So that's the principle. That's what Don Juan's talking about. You can make yourself miserable or you can make yourself strong. The amount of effort is actually the same. The amount of energy to accumulate it, it starts to feel easier, but you're still giving it the energy and the attention and the emotion and the habitual response that it needs to exist. So you're still giving it the energy. It just feels easier because you're so used to it. Does that basic principle make any sense? What Don Juan is trying to say there? People argue that quote because they're like, no, it's much easier to make myself miserable. Well, yeah. That's the accumulation principle of momentum. You've just gotten really good at it. And you're not very practiced at taking care of yourself, being kind to yourself, creating space for others, not being as judgmental, redirecting when you feel yourself going in a direction that makes you feel unwell and makes others feel unwell. That's even worse. Like you're trying to make others feel unwell. Easy when you practice, yes. All right, so that's the quote that we're going to work with a little bit for the week or so. I don't know how long it will take, but I have 5 breathing techniques, and then we're just going to have to start to jump into them next week. The first one is the smooth breath, right? And I'll give some examples of that. But the other 4 will be breath techniques that you can use at different points throughout your day. Because also, I don't want anybody to think that, I'm just this smooth, relaxed, even breath from the time that no, like if I'm physically exerting myself, I need to breathe in a certain way. If maybe things are getting exciting around me and I need to root myself, I have to breathe in a certain kind of way, but it's all still smooth. That's why we start with the smooth breath. Does that make sense? So I can actually, breathe in a way that is like really bringing oxygen into my cells without it being rough and forced and uneven. It can still be smooth and powerful. Smooth doesn't imply frail and weak. You can smoothly breathe a lot of air. It's just going to feel very balanced and powerful. Does that make sense? So that's what we'll be getting into. And hopefully this will help a person who's interested in doing such things to maintain awareness on their breath, which will help them maintain awareness on the cognition direction. And who said it earlier? We were talking about contentment. We want to create the space necessary to cultivate ... I recommend contentment. That's my favorite. Contentment, appreciation, awe for the moment. Those are the things that I find the most groovy. Freedom, this feeling that I feel absolutely free in this moment. Like my spirit feels free, my body is free to move. Like that type of feeling is something that I can establish and cultivate if the other 3 directions are solid. Does that make sense where I'm going with everything? The direction of intention here. We want to get to the cultivation factor. because then you can cultivate peace, you can cultivate love, you can cultivate excitement, you can cultivate adventure, you could cultivate mystery, you could cultivate science, you could cultivate engineering, you could cultivate romance, you could cultivate quietude, you could cultivate social interactions with people, you could cultivate politics and your ability to debate with people. Cultivate requires a whole lot of focus and attention and momentum. And I think that everybody here can get there. I am working with that. Every day I wake up and I activate this contentment, because I need it. I don't want to get nervous about exams. A little bit is probably natural right before the exam, but I don't want to be thinking about that. That doesn't help me focus on what I need to focus on so that I can do well, does it? With all that said, I got to walk my dogs and I got to study because I got to do well. All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns before we head out? Nothing major? Okay. Well, I'll be back tomorrow, 5:30. We have another class. We're switching back to the basics, and we'll be talking about the core methodology again, because we still had a couple topics to cover. And then that is the core. If you understand that core methodology, then everything else that I will talk about will make sense. How to do it, not how to understand it. We already understand it. We need to know how to do this.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.